I'm Amy Zawi with the Jerusalem Connection Red Alert Report for Wednesday, November 6th. Are you watching the UN? I'd like to continue my discussion from last week where we were talking about a UN Watch report that was released in July 2019 that very systematically analyzed and provides the data for the notion that the UN is not doing enough to identify and combat anti-Semitism, thus making it acceptable and more mainstream around the world, and anti-Semitism activities continue to rise, threatening Jews worldwide and, of course, the nation of Israel. The second part of the findings were the rise of anti-Semitism amongst left-wing politics and Muslim extremism, and that is a source of much of the attacks and of what's going on today. And the default position since the Nazi era has always been to blame such sentiments and events on the far right or fascist side of the political spectrum. The identification of the dual-edged sword under which the Jews and Israel finds itself is dulled in the media and the establishment by the UN as the left and the Islamic fuel points of it are ignored, excused, or whitewashed by the United Nations. The Watch report is urging the UN body to recognize these sources of sentiment and attacks, to expose it, and to work to combat it. Muslim anti-Semitism, as the report notes, was carefully reviewed in the responses of various UN officials. That means that various UN officials around the world have made anti-Semitic remarks, speeches, posts on social media, or failed to decry when organizations have posted those types of messages. 30% of attacks in the FRA organization in Europe identified the perpetrators of attacks of anti-Semitic actions in Europe were originated by Muslims with extreme views. 21% said the perpetrator was someone with a left-wing view, and 13% the perpetrator was someone with a right-wing view. So clearly anti-Semitism and its violence is being sourced from all sides. But what is being ignored by the UN is the left and the Muslim side of the stats and the minority at present of the right-hand side of the stats, although it all has to be addressed, of course. Jewish people in Europe responded to surveys noting that nowadays anti-Semitism is unfortunately mostly present in the Muslim and left-wing circles. That's from a respondent in Germany. A respondent from Denmark said, "For many years being Jewish in Denmark was not a problem. In this millennium, we have started to see threats, offending statements, and terrorist attacks against persons characterized as Jews, and the majority of these have been initiated by people with a Muslim background." The extremely high rates of anti-Semitism in the Arab and Muslim world were documented by the ADL in a global survey. They found that despite the almost non-existent Jewish populations among these areas in the Middle East, 74% of the population in Middle East and North Africa harbor anti-Semitic attitudes. Just because the Jewish people don't live in these areas does not mean the racial attitudes do not exist. And these racial attitudes by the Muslim community are gaining attraction around the world as people emigrate from those areas into Europe and America. The report goes on to indicate that that it has been documented in Muslim communities and in mosques around Germany and Europe and America, where imams have been specifically calling for the eradication of Jews, calling Jews the vilest of people. In California, imams saying they are unjust tyrants. We must destroy them. Imams in Copenhagen and Toulouse have been calling for the killing of Jews, all these from the pulpits and not isolated in Middle Eastern communities where Jewish people do not live. That is why it is so dangerous. As well, the Labour Party, as I mentioned last week, Jeremy Corbyn's rise to power is another example of how it has infiltrated the left wing or the liberal side of politics. And we have seen this in America with Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar in the United States House of Representatives. Again, when different UN officials or world leaders or prominent people tweet or give speeches with anti-Semitic tropes or referring to Jewish people in any kind of derogatory way or discriminatory way, they are allowed to go untested. And that is what the report is urging the UN not to allow to keep happening. The use of conspiracy theories and blood libel and Holocaust denial continues unabated, the report goes on, and there is no action or response from the UN. So with that, they are encouraging that the UN body recognize the hatred and violence from all sources of anti-Semitism, particularly the Arab and Muslim world, and that UN officials stop ignoring that incitement. They go on to say that the overall failure of the UN on racism to address these problems are indeed fueling the fire that Jews around the world are feeling. Given the disproportionately high number of anti-Semitic attacks in many countries compared to attacks on other minorities, we, the UN Watch, also urge all UN officials to be more vocal in condemning anti-Semitism. This is a sentiment that I've also echoed several times over the years. The idea if these certain types of criminal attacks or terrorist attacks took place against any other ethnic group or minority or identifiable organization, just rightfully so, the world would be up in arms. But once it happens against Jewish people or even Israel as a nation state, it is ignored or shoulders or shrugged, or it is somehow excused. The report goes on to say that UNRWA staff in particular are exposing their anti-Semitic bent, including social media posts that praise Hitler and incite the killing of Jews, and this violates the UN employee stance on neutrality. Again, other officials and examples of anti-Semitic activity or lack of response to obvious anti-Semitic activity are pointed out. With that, the United Nations Watch is the first on record with such a detailed report to speak out often when these UN officials or their organizations that they support act in an anti-Semitic fashion, most of the time on social media, and they demand that the UN officials above those people take action. Sometimes this is granted and sometimes it's not, but it's a shame that the organization needs to be called out in such a way and that it can't have people that are at least neutral in their outspokenness and fair, and that when it does happen, the UN can't figure it out for themselves and take appropriate action. So if you want to find this report online, it is available. It is a July 2019 publication of the UN Watch report on anti-Semitism. And like I said, it is well documented. It's full of incident and detail and data for the origin and the events of attacks, how officials in leadership, elected and otherwise, have responded or not responded, and how statements and organizational activities such as Holocaust Memorial Day are being watered down and whitewashed. All of this being documented by UN Watch to underscore the importance of recognizing how and why anti-Semitism today is on the rise, where it's coming from, how to target it and combat it, as well as recognize the truth of how it hurts people and it is discriminatory. We want to keep all these players and efforts in our prayers. These people are coming from a variety of backgrounds who want to stop this, and we applaud them for their effort, and I thank them for their reporting. Shavua Tov, and have a great week.